London in the early 1820s was a city of noise, soot, and ambition. Streets choked with horses and carts, market criers, and chimney smoke. In the district of Wapping close to the docks, where flour sacks were unloaded daily from merchant ships, flour was both currency and lifeblood. And it was here, amid the murk and clatter of trade, that one of London's most peculiar swindles quietly took shape. You could walk down Wapping High Street and catch the smell of it: flour, yeast, damp sackcloth. Barrels of wheat lined the alleyways, bound for bakers across the city. And in the thick of this trade was a man named Elias Droot, a bookkeeper by title but something far less honest by action. Elias was not the kind of man you notice. He was neither tall nor short, wore plain wool suits, and had hands always slightly coated in chalky dust from his frequent visits to the mills. He worked for Chappell and Sons, a modest but well-connected grain distributor that served over 24 bakeries across East London. Elias, who had begun as a humble tallyman, gradually rose in rank not because of charm, but because of an unusual knack for numbers. His ledgers were immaculate, almost too immaculate. The landscape of crime. To understand the significance of what Elias would do, it's worth pausing here. The 1820s were years of economic squeeze. Bread riots were not unheard of. The corn laws had driven up grain prices. The working class felt it first, then the bakers, then the millers, and then everyone else. So when a sack of flour went missing, no one panicked. These things happened: a burst seam, a short count from the docks, a dishonest porter. No one imagined it was part of a plan. Except that it was. The beginnings of the swindle. It started with sack rotation. Chappell and Sons used stamped canvas sacks that were cycled between mill, warehouse, and bakery. Each sack was counted, recorded, weighed, and expected to return. Elias, who handled the tallies, began to slightly adjust the records. One sack in 100 would go unlisted on the outgoing manifest. That sack, naturally, went somewhere else. But where? Elias' scheme relied on two simple observations. No one ever double-checked the porters. The smaller the theft, the less suspicion it raised. He worked with a man named George Tadlow, a retired barrowman who had taken up casual work helping with unloading at the docks. George had debts and a limp, and more importantly, few questions. For 6 pence a week, he agreed to walk one unmarked sack each Wednesday down to a seemingly abandoned warehouse on Bell Wharf Lane. And this was where the plot took shape. Elias began selling the flour privately, to a collection of small bakeries not serviced by Chappell and Sons. These bakers were desperate, and Elias, offering flour at slightly reduced prices and no questions asked, became a quiet supplier under the name Mr. Shaw. The complexity increases. This small operation ran for nearly a year. Over that time, Elias expanded: 2 sacks a week, then 3. He bought new canvas sacks, forged Chappell stamps with a brass mold, and rotated them back into the cycle. He learned how to sew seams like a warehouseman. He even tracked the movements of the foremen to avoid scrutiny. He was methodical, almost obsessive. He kept no written records of the transactions. All payments were made in coin. He buried the surplus money beneath the cellar floor of a property he rented under a pseudonym in Bethnal Green. The scheme worked until someone looked too closely at a seam. A needle and thread. It was Mrs. Honor Digby, a clerk's wife and part-time cleaner at one of the receiving bakeries, who noticed the oddity. She was folding flour sacks for reuse when she saw a faint inconsistency. The thread used to sew the base was a different shade of cream, a nearly invisible difference, but one she'd seen before when mending her husband's trousers. She mentioned it to the head baker, Mr. March, who in turn brought it up at a guild meeting. Nothing came of it at first. Who listens to a cleaner? But March couldn't let it go. He had noticed, too, that sacks marked with those odd seams never came through Chappell's usual delivery boys. He began asking quiet questions. A name surfaces. In the months that followed, March compiled a list of these unusual sacks and discovered they all arrived on Wednesdays, around the same time. The man who dropped them off called himself Mr. Shaw, wore a gray cap, and always refused receipts. By coincidence or fate, March's cousin worked at Chappell & Sons. A conversation at Sunday dinner led to a mention of Mr. Shaw, and the cousin frowned. That was no one on their books. Still, suspicion is not proof. So March did what few might expect in such a minor case. He wrote directly to the City of London police, detailing his concern about the possibly fraudulent deliveries. They did not reply immediately. But someone was listening. Quiet surveillance. A constable named Edwin Firth, known for his interest in economic crimes, took it upon himself to quietly investigate. He began by watching the alleyway near Bell Wharf Lane. On a Wednesday morning, under light drizzle, he saw a man with a limp carrying a flour sack not marked with the usual trade route stamp. Firth followed the man. It led to the same abandoned warehouse. From there, the sack was collected an hour later by a thin man in a gray cap. Firth would later describe the man as entirely forgettable, which made him memorable in itself. He had found Mr. Shaw, but he did not yet know his real name. Suspicion closes in. Over the next 3 weeks, Firth built a case. He tracked the paths of the sacks, found the bakeries receiving them, and quietly took samples of the flour. All bore the same characteristic slightly coarser grind, typical of the mill Chappell & Sons used, and an unusual smell, due to a specific barley blend in one of their wheat shipments from Ireland. With evidence mounting, Firth approached Chappell & Sons under pretense of conducting a review on dock security. He spoke with several employees, including the clerk in charge of manifests Elias Droot. And something, Firth would later say, didn't quite sit right with Mr. Droot. As the paper trail begins to tighten and identities inch toward revelation, the question remains: did Elias act alone, or had the rot in the flour trade gone deeper than one man's greed? When Constable Edwin Firth met Elias Droot for the first time, he did not yet know his name. He knew only the smell of damp flour, the echo of cautious footsteps in the warehouse corridor, and the way Elias had momentarily frozen when asked a harmless question. Do you double count the sacks yourself, or is that handled by your porters? A small hesitation, barely a flicker, but enough for Firth to remember. Elias answered smoothly eventually. The porters mark the count and I log them. It's all quite routine. But what Elias didn't realize was that this answer had already betrayed him, because Chappell & Sons did not use porters to tally. Their supervisors handled the count directly. Firth had learned that 2 days earlier during a walkthrough of the West Dock. From that moment on, Elias Droot wasn't just suspicious. He became the prime suspect. A quiet pattern of deceit. Back at Bishopsgate Station, Firth opened what he called his flour file, a modest collection of handwritten notes, sackcloth samples, and 3 flour samples wrapped in brown paper. He documented everything meticulously, an old habit from his father's time as a watchmaker. Precision mattered. In the following week, he returned to Chappell & Sons under the pretense of collecting customs data. This time, he asked for access to past ledgers. The ledgers were clean, too clean. No inconsistencies, no ink blotches, all in the same tight, even script. But here was the rub: Elias had made no mistakes, and that for Firth was itself a mistake. Accounts in high-volume businesses, especially ones relying on weekly ship deliveries, were rarely flawless. Dates shifted, shipments spilled, ledgers changed hands, but not in Elias' books. They were nearly perfect for 14 consecutive months. Firth began to compare the flour manifest logs to dock gate tallies, which were logged separately by the dock inspector's office. That's when he noticed it: a faint, repeating irregularity. Every Wednesday between 6:00 and 7:00 a.m., One less sack was listed entering chapel's storage than was marked on the dock tallies. But by midday, the counts matched again. A sack appeared on paper only, phantom inventory. Elias was stealing flour, covering the gap with delayed entries, and rotating the sacks so that the missing ones appeared to return. After being replaced with counterfeits, he'd marked himself. A surprise visit. Firth decided to make his move, but not with arrests yet. He wanted to rattle Elias, test his resolve. On the morning of November 3, 1824, Firth arrived unannounced at Elias' modest rented home in Bethnal Green. The house sat behind a butcher's stall and a grimy hat shop. Elias had rented the back quarters under the name Mr. Edwin Shaw. He answered the door in shirt sleeves, surprised but composed. Firth, ever polite, explained that he was conducting a new audit on unofficial warehousing practices and had come across his name in a few ledgers. Elias blinked once, twice, but allowed him in. Inside, the rooms were sparse. A clock ticked too loudly. Firth noted the faint scent of grain and the layer of dust on every surface except the kitchen floor, which had clearly been swept recently. He made small talk, commented on the quality of flour in East London, asked about millers, bakers, logistics. Elias played along, until Firth asked offhand, "And what sort of man do you think Mr. Shaw is?" There was no flicker this time. Elias had prepared for that name. He laughed slightly and claimed he had no idea, probably a supplier, he said. There were many. Firth stood slowly, glanced around once more and said, "Strange. He seems to like this street." Then left. A hidden floorboard. Firth returned 2 nights later, not through the front door but with a warrant and a locksmith. Inside the property, his instincts were confirmed. In the back room near the fireplace, one floorboard was newer than the others. Beneath it lay a tin box of coin purses, roughly 37 pounds in mixed shillings and crowns. 8 cloth stamps made of brass, each marked C and S. 2 sealed letters, both addressed to East End bakeries, requesting flour deliveries signed E. Shaw. The evidence was enough. But Firth wasn't done. He left everything exactly where he found it and resealed the floor. He wanted to see who else came to visit. An unexpected twist. That Friday, under cover of fog, a figure entered the Bethnal Green house. Firth, now staking out the alley across the street, watched through the slats of an abandoned coal cart. It wasn't Elias. It was George Tadlow, the retired barrowman. Firth followed him quietly as he carried a single sack, slung low over one shoulder. The destination, not Bell Wharf Lane but a new location near Shadwell Basin. Firth watched the drop. George left the sack inside a gated alley and walked away. An hour later, another man retrieved it. But it wasn't Elias. It was Thomas Carow, a name that had not yet appeared in any documents. A baker, yes, but also someone with a criminal record for bootlegging 5 years prior. The plot had thickened. A network of quiet theft. Over the next week, Firth and 2 constables conducted early morning surveillance. They traced 4 distinct flour drop locations and identified at least 6 bakeries receiving the illegal sacks. Each recipient swore they believed Mr. Shaw to be a legitimate wholesaler. The stolen flour was being laundered mixed with legal supplies, baked into loaves, and sold under the noses of the city's inspectors. And the worst part, the operation had grown too large for Elias alone. The arrest. On November 19, 1824, just as dawn broke over the damp rooftops of Wapping, Elias Droot was arrested at his chapel and son's office. His hands were chalky with flour. In his drawer were 3 unregistered tally slips and a note to GT with Wednesday's quantity. 2 sacks, no tags. He offered no resistance. In fact, he reportedly said, "I expected this much sooner." That same day, George Tadlow and Thomas Caro were also detained. 2 more bakeries were raided. 17 counterfeit sacks were seized. But even in custody, Elias was quiet, cooperative, calm. When asked why he did it, he said only, "The weight of flour changes with the weather, but men, they stay greedy." Yet even with Elias in custody and the counterfeit sacks catalogued, one question remained: who had taught Elias the trick with the stamps? And could it be that someone else, higher up the chain, had been quietly profiting all along? The arrest of Elias Drew and the quiet unraveling of one of London's most peculiar food fraud schemes might have been the end of a minor scandal. Yet what followed over the next 6 months would ripple through trade guilds, bakeries, and legal circles like flour dust through a sunlit warehouse. Elias had been caught red-handed. The evidence was overwhelming: covert ledgers, counterfeit cloth stamps, testimony from the bakers who bought under-the-counter sacks, and the floorboard stash. But even now, the full shape of the swindle had not yet come into view. The trial would change that. A courtroom unprepared. In March of 1825, Elias stood trial at the Old Bailey, formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and the unlawful misrepresentation of goods in trade. His co-conspirators George Tadlow and Thomas Caro were tried separately, although their fates were deeply entangled. What made the case unusual was its lack of drama. No murder, no high-speed chase, no masked thieves. This was a quiet crime built on flour sacks, pencil entries, and routine deceit. Still, the courtroom was packed. Merchants feared exposure of wider practices. Bakers feared regulatory overreach. And several guild officers from the Bakers' Company were present to see just how deeply this Mr. Shaw operation had infected their industry. The testimony of Elias Drew. Elias, when called to testify, shocked everyone. He did not deny the charges. Instead, he spoke clearly, softly, and with something bordering on pride. He explained his method in detail. How he identified gaps in inventory procedure during his second year at Chappell & Sons. How the rotation system of flour sacks, intended to promote thrift, instead made tracking difficult. How he experimented with brass-stamped counterfeits, then perfected them by soaking them in molasses to match the warehouse-aged smell. How he avoided paper records entirely, conducting all off-book transactions in person and in coin. And most damningly, he revealed that others had done it before him. A hidden precedent. In a dramatic moment near the end of his testimony, Elias turned toward the gallery and said, "This practice did not begin with me. I merely watched and improved. If you look at the ledgers of Mr. Fernwick, the clerk before me, you'll find similar gaps, identical entries. Only he was never caught." The courtroom erupted. Mr. Fernwick had retired in 1821 and died shortly thereafter. His records were never audited. In the days following the claim, Firth revisited the old manifests. Indeed, over a 9-month period in 1820, a single sack discrepancy appeared nearly every fortnight. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to become a pattern if you were looking. The bigger picture. The judge, in a rare comment from the bench, remarked, "Though the theft was quiet, the damage to public trust is loud. Bread, sirs, is not merely a commodity. It is the symbol of a man's daily table." And that was the heart of the matter. This wasn't about flour. It was about food security at a time when London teetered on unrest and hunger. The corn laws, still in force, kept grain prices high and bread expensive. Small bakeries struggled to survive. That, ironically, was why Elias' scheme had flourished. He had filled a need: cheaper flour under the table, no questions asked. In many ways, his clients had been complicit by necessity. Sentencing. Elias was sentenced to 7 years transportation to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania. A harsh punishment for a quiet fraud, but one meant to send a message. George Tadlow, due to his age and perceived minor role, received 2 years hard labor. Thomas Carroll, caught selling stolen goods and obstructing investigation, received 4 years in Newgate Prison. But the trial did not end there. The City of London's Grain Merchant Guild issued a report within the month. It urged better sack tracking systems, required double signature manifests, and introduced a new regulation: seam tags sewn with unique dyed thread per supplier. It was the first formal food traceability reform in that industry. The personal fallout. Elias' name faded from newspapers after he was shipped out in June. But in the East End, the whispers persisted. Some claimed he had bribed guards and lived in comfort in Holborn. Others said he died at sea. Records suggest he arrived safely in Tasmania and was put to work as an accountant on a government grain store. By 1832, he had earned his freedom. He never returned to England. Of his illicit earnings, nearly £120 over 3 years, none was ever recovered. His Bethnal Green house remained vacant for months. The floorboard, the one he had so carefully resealed, was eventually pried up by children playing with marbles. They found only dust and a single brass stamping tool, rusted and blackened. A reflection in white. The Flour Sack Swindle did not spark riots or scandal. It wasn't discussed in Parliament. No dramatist turned it into a play. But among warehousemen, dockers, and bookkeepers, it became a quiet cautionary tale. And among crime historians, it holds a strange place. A reminder that sometimes the cleverest criminals don't steal gold or jewels or secrets. They steal what everyone needs, and no one watches closely enough. And so, as the flour dust settled in 1820s London, the lesson remained: not all theft is loud. Some comes with ledgers, logic, and linen sacks sewn just slightly wrong. Cork, Ireland, 1831. A city in transition, still licking its wounds from the Napoleonic Wars, still bruised by famine scares, yet swelling with market life and merchant ambition. The port bustled, and trade routes flickered between fishing villages and urban squares like veins feeding a restless body. It was in this cobbled, fog-draped maze of alleys and marketplaces that a small-time greengrocer named Finbar Gleeson began one of the most unusual counterfeiting operations ever recorded in Munster. His weapon of choice, not a press, not a forge, a cabbage cart. The smell of produce and deception. You could find Finbar every Wednesday and Friday near the Coal Quay Market, his cart creaking under the weight of cabbage, turnips, onions, and the occasional gooseberry crate. His clothes were stained with earth, his cap always damp. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept well in years, but his voice carried a sing-song lilt, and the other traders tolerated him, if not trusted him. He lived alone above a crumbling alehouse in Barrack Street, paid his dues late, and never once joined the Merchants' Guild. He seemed, in every respect, forgettable. But Finbar had something no one else had: a paper press hidden under his cart floorboards, and the knowledge of ink mixing passed down from an uncle who once forged shipping manifests for rebel couriers. He wasn't making banknotes, not yet. Instead, he began with coinage notes, specifically small shilling coupons issued by local shops and grocers during coin shortages. At the time, change was scarce in rural Ireland, and many merchants issued their own token notes, receipts that functioned as cash within a small radius. Finbar noticed something about them: they were rarely tracked. A simple beginning. It began as a test. He hand-pressed a token supposedly from Mullany's Hardware, a shop across town, a half-shilling chit. He folded it twice, rubbed it between his palms for aging, and handed it to a butcher named Keane as payment for a lamb's heart. Keane accepted it without question. Finbar walked out with the heart and a grin. Over the next 3 weeks, Finbar slowly expanded his currency. He replicated 3 additional merchant stamps using carved potatoes and linseed oil, then applied them to slips of rough paper aged with soot and vinegar. The merchants, meanwhile, never noticed because these tokens came back to them so slowly, scattered across different districts, never in suspicious volume. Finbar would later say in his only surviving statement, "I didn't print money, I printed belief." The cart becomes a mint. By summer, Finbar's cabbage cart had transformed into a rolling counterfeiting lab. The cabbage crates were false-bottomed, padded with hay and wax paper to protect his printing tools. He began experimenting with larger denominations, local promissory notes from larger grocers in the North Main Street quarter. These were worth 2 shillings or more, enough to purchase meat, ale, candles, and even rent for a week. Finbar's key innovation wasn't artistic. His notes were crudely printed, often slightly off-color. But he understood human psychology. He targeted tradespeople under pressure, buying only in moments of rush, confusion, or poor lighting. And most importantly, he never reused a forged note in the same quarter. His cart rolled between Shandon, Blackpool, and Turner's Cross, offering an ever-moving trail of cabbage and counterfeit. A rumor in the wind. In October 1831, a grocer named Mrs. Delahunt noticed a familiar signature on a promissory note, her own, except she hadn't issued a 2-shilling note in over 6 months. She reported it to a local constable, but the matter was dismissed as an isolated forgery. Shop-level counterfeits weren't uncommon in the era. Still, Delahunt began asking her suppliers and neighbors to check their tokens more carefully. By December, 5 different traders came forward with mismatched stamps or oddly textured paper. The rumors started. Someone, they said, was copying Cork's currency of trust. But who would bother? It seemed too small a scam, too laborious. That's when the name Finbar the Frail surfaced. A watchful eye. Constable Aidan Byon, newly promoted and eager to impress, took a quiet interest. He began trailing Finbar from a distance, observing him on market days. Byon noted his peculiar cart design, the care with which he loaded and unloaded crates, and his habit of buying rather than bartering, a strange trait for a greengrocer. On January 3, 1832, Byon followed Finbar to a tannery on Blarney Lane. Finbar emerged with 4 lengths of calfskin and 2 large pots of dye. Odd purchases for a cabbage man. Still, that wasn't enough for arrest. Byon escalated the matter to Inspector Tag Moll, who agreed to authorize a covert inspection of Finbar's flat. The upstairs secret. By torchlight and silence, the search began. The alehouse landlord, a man named Donnelly, let the officers into Finbar's room while he was away selling at the docks. Inside, they found a drying rack hung with aged papers marked with oil stamps, a false ledger book with lists of token denominations and towns, a series of hand-carved wooden stamps, including one with the distinctive M of Mullany's Hardware. But the most damning evidence lay beneath his mattress, a sheaf of unissued counterfeit notes bundled in a roll of waxed linen, and beside it a small notebook titled Circulation Paths. It included routes, districts, and dates. Finbar hadn't just been forging, he was mapping, controlling flow, avoiding detection through staggering and rotation. He had turned Cork's informal economy into his own counterfeit circuit. A mistake in the fog. And yet he might have escaped justice, if not for the cabbage crate with a loose nail. On a foggy morning in February 1832, while rolling into the Grand Parade, Finbar hit a stone gutter too hard. A corner of his cart splintered and the floorboard beneath the produce flipped open. Out slid a bundle of half-shilling notes, some blank, some partially printed. A passerby gasped, a boy shouted. Finbar froze. By the time he recovered and tried to flee, Byon had already spotted him. 2 constables blocked the street's far end. Finbar was tackled before he reached Castle Street. He went down without a word. But was Finbar truly alone in his operation? Or had he, like many before him, been part of a broader network, one with ties deeper than cabbage crates and street ink? When Finbar Gleeson was pulled from the cobbles of Castle Street, his cart lay on its side like a wounded animal, half spilled with cabbage, broken floorboards exposed, and ink-streaked papers fluttering in the February wind. Onlookers gathered, curious but unalarmed. After all, they had known Finbar for years. He was a fixture, quiet, always paid in coin, never drank more than one ale. But now the whispers turned. Forgery, some said, never would have guessed. Down at Bridewell Jail, Finbar remained mostly silent. When questioned about the counterfeit tokens found under his cart and in his room, he offered only one statement: "If you feed them faith, they'll take anything." The Notebook of Roots. The small linen-bound notebook recovered from Finbar's mattress became the centerpiece of the investigation. Each page detailed routes, denominations, merchant stamp patterns, and most critically, drop locations. Places where Finbar would allegedly pass forged notes to intermediaries who would later use them in a separate part of town. What startled Inspector Mal was that several names appeared multiple times. El Mackey, Lower Glanmire; Brandy, near Key Pump; W of Shandon, bread tokens only. It suggested an informal network, not of professional criminals, but of desperate traders complicit out of convenience. Each seemed to receive forged tokens with instructions: use them in high-volume shops, never in the same district twice, and never more than once a week. Finbar had created what could only be called a shadow economy, hidden within the legal one. The forgery trade of small towns. To understand how Finbar's scheme remained invisible for so long, it helps to consider the economic backdrop. In early 1830s Ireland, coinage was scarce, particularly in rural areas. Barter remained common. Shop-issued trade tokens often substituted for change and were accepted broadly, despite lacking formal backing from banks. These tokens were supposed to be temporary, but in places like Cork, they became quasi-permanent currency. Finbar exploited this. He didn't forge high-value bills or fake sovereigns. He faked the everyday small tokens, minor notes, shilling substitutes. Individually, they drew no attention. Collectively, they leaked value from real merchants and redirected it into his pocket and the pockets of those who circulated them for a cut. The quiet participants. Through questioning and discreet visits, Inspector Molly's constables found 4 additional individuals named in Finbar's book. None were traditional criminals. El Mackey was a 62-year-old widow who ran a candied nut stall. She admitted to receiving a few notes from the cabbage man in exchange for helping spend them on the other side of town. Brandy, a shoemaker's apprentice, confessed to taking the odd chit and passing it to a baker when things got tight. W of Shandon was never identified, but at least 2 bakeries in Shandon reported finding identical, forged bread tokens weeks apart. No one claimed to know how Finbar produced them. No one claimed to know his real source of paper. The paper trail. That source came to light through an unexpected turn. A constable named P. Hanrahan, tasked with tracing Finbar's purchases, visited the tannery on Blarney Lane where Finbar had bought calfskin and dye. The owner, Mr. Foley, recalled something unusual. He never wanted full sheets, always scraps, edges, the bits most won't bother with. Foley sold him the waste pieces, trimmings from processed hides and dried pulp fragments. Combined with linen scraps and lampblack, this allowed Finbar to press his own textured paper, rough to the touch, slightly gray, perfect for passing off as cheaply produced local scrip. He had no press in the flat. It was the cart itself, fitted with a sliding clamp, 2 iron weights, and a heat pan fueled by an oil canister that acted as a mobile printing press. Interrogation and revelation. On March 1, 1832, after a week in custody, Finbar finally broke silence. He didn't confess in defiance or tears. Instead, he spoke slowly, carefully, as if teaching a class. "I watched where people spent, what they handed over, and what they never looked at. I learned what made a thing pass as money wasn't its worth, but how busy the man was who took it." He admitted he had been operating for nearly 3 years, but only escalated in the last 8 months. His motives: rent cabbage rots, ink doesn't. What remained unclear deliberately so was how many others had taken part, and whether there had ever been a larger figure behind him. Some in Cork's underworld whispered that Finbar had once worked with a printer from Dublin, expelled after the 1823 banknote inquiry. Others believed a clerk at the custom house had fed him merchant seal samples. None of these rumors were ever confirmed. The trial. Finbar was tried in April 1832 under charges of uttering forged instruments, fraudulent use of merchant seals, and the manufacture of counterfeit token currency. He did not deny his role. Instead, in a calm but slightly hoarse voice, he said to the judge, "I never robbed a man's home. I gave him change. He chose to believe it." His words were not taken kindly. Despite appeals from 2 grocers who admitted accepting his notes without trouble, and despite testimonies showing that none of the forgeries exceeded a few shillings, the court viewed Finbar as a public risk. He was sentenced to 5 years, penal labor at Spike Island, off the coast of Cobb, reserved for non-violent but serious offenders. A cart left behind. The cabbage cart, now stripped of its false floor and confiscated parts, was left in the station yard for weeks. Eventually, a younger greengrocer from Shandon took it and resumed selling vegetables with no modifications. Locals still referred to it as the Mint on Wheels. Finbar served 4 years. Upon release in 1836, records place him briefly in Limerick, working as a night watchman near the docks. He disappeared from public record thereafter. The lingering effect. Finbar's case was cited in a guild circular the following year, calling for an end to unofficial merchant token systems, a registry of all issued promissory notes, and eventually pressure that contributed to the Bank Charter Act of 1844, which formalized currency regulation. A cabbage seller from Cork had, indirectly, helped shape the future of money control in Ireland. Still, the question lingered. Was Finbar just a clever man trying to survive, or a front for something larger, deeper, and still operating in the markets and streets beyond the gaze of watchmen? When Finbar Gleeson arrived at Spike Island in the summer of 1832, the rain came sideways off the Atlantic, and the stone corridors smelled of salt and soot. A fortress-turned penal colony, Spike was an unforgiving place: gray walls, stricter discipline, and a sense of distance not just from freedom, but from usefulness. And yet even here Finbar remained, observant. For a man who had built a criminal enterprise not on force, but on paper, timing, and trust, prison offered no release from curiosity. A prisoner who watched. Finbar was assigned to menial duties, hauling coal, emptying refuse, but he paid attention to more than just his daily tasks. He noted how rations were distributed, how work was assigned, and most importantly, how favors were traded in the absence of coin. Spike Island had its own currency contraband, and more often, paper slips. Not forged money this time, but IOUs, scribbled deals between inmates, borrowed bread notes exchanged for pipe tobacco or a night of protection. And what did Finbar see? An economy waiting to be manipulated. The return of the token. In his 2nd year at Spike, Finbar began quietly producing slips of script mimicking the handwriting of guards or work supervisors, nodding fake approvals or additional bread rations with plausible signatures. He would pass them on to weaker inmates, who used them to secure extra soup or shelter space. When discovered, the guards assumed a junior officer had made a clerical error. The deception was minor. No formal inquiry followed. Finbar had recreated his token system within a prison. But it did last. By 1835, a younger inmate, Seamus Wrigley, was caught attempting to barter with a script slip bearing an identical forged signature. Under questioning, he named Finbar. This time there was no trial, no courtroom, just 6 months in solitary confinement and a ban from communal labor. That broke him. Guards later noted that Finbar emerged quieter, slower, and prone to long silences. He was moved to basic sanitation duties and largely ignored. He was released in March of 1836, his sentence served. No one came to collect him. He walked off the island carrying a burlap sack, a broken bootlace, and the same half-sardonic expression he'd worn at his arrest. A ghost in Limerick. A single parish record in Limerick, dated August 1836, notes a man matching Finbar's description working as a night watchman at a grain store near the docks. His name was listed as Fin G. Within months, that store was burned in a dock fire. There is no evidence Finbar was involved. He disappeared from record after that. Some believe he died during the fire. Others suggest he returned to Cork under a new name. A few folktales even imagine him forging ship logs for smugglers out of Galway Bay. But in the end, Finbar vanished as quietly as he had entered history, like a note passed in a crowded market and forgotten once spent. The larger legacy. Finbar's crimes, at first glance, seem almost laughable by modern standards. He didn't rob banks. He didn't forge hundreds of pounds. He forged half-shilling tokens and grocers' notes. He tricked butchers and bakers, not governments. But his actions shone a light on how informal economies operated. They revealed how trust can serve as a currency, how paper, however crude, can carry value if enough people believe in it, and how the lack of official oversight in struggling systems creates the very gaps where small, clever criminals can thrive. His arrest prompted Cork's merchant class to phase out paper tokens entirely. Within 5 years, most local shops stopped issuing promissory scrip. Some formed collective credit systems. Others aligned with post offices to access official notes more reliably. Eventually, the Bank Charter Act of 1844 in Britain and Ireland would formalize currency issuance and outlaw private token money altogether. Finbar Gleeson had no place in that new world. A cart without wheels. Today, few remember his name. There is no statue, no plaque in the market square. But among archivists and economic historians, the cabbage cart counterfeiter remains a strange case, a story not of greed, but of ingenuity shaped by scarcity. A tale of small crime in a forgotten economy. Because sometimes, crime is not about how much you take, but how quietly you take it, how cleverly you pass it, and how long it takes before anyone notices. The year was 1887, and the small town of Knaresborough, nestled along the River Nid in North Yorkshire, basked in the glow of late Victorian prosperity. The railway had arrived a decade earlier, bringing with it tourists, gentry, and a trickle of wealth. Among the cobbled streets and moss-covered rooftops stood Clemency House, a quaint tea room known for its butter scones, strong black Assam, and a certain delicate charm that soothed the nerves of the town's weary visitors. Clemency House was not a grand establishment. Just 6 tables, pressed linen, and a cracked bell above the front door that gave a weary jingle with every customer. Behind the counter, always serene and soft-spoken, was Miss Ida Greaves, the proprietress. Miss Greaves was, by all appearances, the very model of domestic grace. A widow at 39, she wore her mourning black with quiet pride. Locals described her as a gentle sort, always with the kettle on. But within 2 years, 4 of her most frequent patrons were dead. And the town was whispering, tea, sugar, and sympathy. Miss Greaves kept a tidy shop. Each morning began at 5:30 with the lighting of the stove and a meticulous wipe-down of her porcelain sugar jars. She prepared the same offerings every day: boiled eggs, toast with gooseberry jam, clotted cream if available, and 3 rotating teas. Her regulars were nearly as clockwork as her menu. Mr. Lyle, a retired postmaster, came Mondays and Thursdays for toast and the Times. Mrs. Bickley, a war widow, came Tuesdays for scones and gossip. Mr. Harrington, a diabetic solicitor, came Fridays for weak tea and eggs. And Miss Rudd, an elderly spinster with no known relatives, came daily, her appetite inexplicably large for her frame. In early 1888, Mr. Lyle collapsed after leaving Clemency House. The cause was listed as heart failure. No autopsy was conducted. 2 months later, Mrs. Bickley took ill after her Tuesday tea. She died within the week. Then came Mr. Harrington, whose blood sugar was thought to be his undoing. And finally, Miss Rudd, found slumped over a half-eaten biscuit outside the town post office. All 4 had been served their final meals by Miss Ida Greaves. A pattern emerges. What made this case so unusual was not just the deaths, but the absence of drama surrounding them. Knaresborough, though quaint, was no stranger to loss. But when the same tea room was mentioned 4 times in 1 year on the lips of the deceased, even the kindliest assumptions began to crack. It was Dr. Felix Cawley, a newly appointed physician to the town, who first raised concern. He had treated Miss Rudd in the final hours of her life and noted symptoms inconsistent with age-related collapse: sweating, abdominal cramping, and constricted pupils. He asked discreetly about the others. None had received a post-mortem. A difficult accusation. Suggesting foul play in a town like Knaresborough was no small matter, especially against a woman like Ida Greaves, who had cared for her ailing husband until his death from typhus and was known to donate leftovers to the parish kitchen. But Dr. Cawley persisted. He convinced Constable Avery, a cautious but fair-minded man, to conduct a discreet inquiry. They did not confront Miss Greaves. Instead, they began interviewing her suppliers, customers, and anyone with insight into her kitchen. Sugar and subtlety. What emerged was subtle but troubling. A grocer named P. Minton, who supplied sugar and flour to Clemency House, mentioned that Miss Greaves had requested a separate tin of powdered sugar each fortnight, for a special recipe, she claimed. But none of her published menus mentioned anything that required it. A schoolgirl who helped with washing noted that Miss Greaves kept 2 sugar jars behind the counter, one for guests, and one she sometimes used just for the elderly. And when a visiting cousin of Mr. Lyle requested to see where the regulars had sat, she found the teacup still unwashed, hidden behind the sink, a faint trace of white residue clinging to its rim. The substance unknown. In April 1888, under a private warrant, Dr. Cawley collected sample spoons from both sugar jars and sent them to a chemist friend in York. The results, returned 2 weeks later, confirmed the presence of aconitine, a rare and highly toxic plant alkaloid derived from aconitum, commonly called monkshood. Aconitine was odorless, tasteless, and in small doses mimicked symptoms of cardiac failure. The dosage needed to kill, less than a pinch of salt. Confrontation at Clemency House. On the morning of May 2, 1888, Constable Avery arrived with 2 officers and a sealed warrant. Miss Greaves was serving tea to a vicar and his wife when the bell jangled and the door opened. She did not resist. She offered them tea. When they refused, she said simply, "Then you'll be wanting the second jar, I suppose." She handed it over without expression. When asked if she knew what was in it, she replied, "Only what I've put in there. No more." But why would a woman like Ida Greaves turn to poison? and why these specific victims, people who, by all accounts, had shown her kindness, patronage, and even friendship. When Miss Ida Greaves was led away from Clemency House, she did not weep. She did not shout. She simply smoothed the front of her apron and turned to Constable Avery with a question. "Would you be kind enough to feed the cat this evening?" It was, to many who witnessed it, more chilling than any scream. The cat, named Malkin, was later found asleep in the warmth of the tea-room oven, purring contentedly among crumbs and cinnamon dust. But while the townsfolk now muttered Ida's name with suspicion and fear, the deeper question remained unanswered. Why? The victims revisited. With her in custody, Inspector George Willans was dispatched from York to lead the formal inquiry. He ordered a series of exhumations, gruesome work for a quiet town, and had samples sent to Bradford's Chemical Analysis Bureau. Each body revealed the same pattern: traces of aconitine concentrated in stomach and liver tissues. The amount varied, but in all cases it was enough to be lethal, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden. Mr. Lyle, heart failure, consistent with mid-dose poisoning. Mrs. Bickley, violent stomach cramping and eventual collapse. Mr. Harrington, believed to be diabetic shock masking the poison. Miss Rudd, the most recent and the most definitive. All signs now pointed to deliberate administration. A woman of routine. Investigators turned back to Ida's habits, looking for motive. Her life, they found, was ruled by routine. She awoke daily at 5:30 a.m. Lit the stove, cleaned the sugar jars, pre-measured her tea leaves. Set 6 place settings, even on days with no bookings. Ate the same breakfast: 1 boiled egg, half a scone, 1 sugarless tea. There were no debts. Her bank account held £19, modest but sufficient. No male suitors, no close female companions. Her husband, Walter Greaves, had died 8 years prior of typhus, an illness from which she had nursed him at home for weeks. Some believed the loneliness had simply overtaken her. Others thought it was something older, deeper. The letters in the drawer. In a locked drawer beneath the counter of Clemency House, officers discovered a collection of old letters. Most were unremarkable recipes, advertisements, invoices. But 6 letters stood out, folded crisply, dated between 1883 and 1885, and all signed by the same hand. Miss Agnes Rudd. The tone was familiar, almost sisterly. She wrote of afternoon teas, of Mrs. Bickley's new hats, of Mr. Lyle's opinions on the parish choir. She wrote of how Ida should be more social, and how a woman of your talents ought not be hiding herself in teapots and bread baskets. The final letter, dated September 1885, read simply, "I hope in time you will learn that charity is not an obligation, but a blessing. I worry that your pride will be your ruin." It seemed trivial, but to Ida Greaves perhaps it had not been. A question of pride. Witnesses recalled that Miss Rudd had been one of the few women Ida could not easily decline. She came often. She stayed late. She made small suggestions about decor. Once, she had rearranged the table flowers herself while Ida was in the back. And it wasn't just Rudd. Mr. Lyle had publicly criticized Clemency House's pricing in 1886. Mrs. Bickley had commented loudly on the fatting quality of Ida's jams. Mr. Harrington once referred to Clemency House as a quiet place for quiet spinsters. Taken alone, these were minor indignities. Taken together, perhaps they were the slow grind of condescension. Condescension suffered in silence, across years of lace napkins and forced smiles. The interrogation. Ida was interviewed at length over 4 days. She never confessed, but she never denied either. When asked directly if she had administered poison, she responded, "Would you suppose I could carry out something like that with one hand pouring and the other stirring?" When asked whether she harbored resentment toward the victims, she said, I did not resent, but I did notice, and I remembered. She asked after the cat again, then fell silent. The trial in York. The Crown v. Ida Greaves opened in October 1888, one of the quieter trials of the year, overshadowed in national papers by more dramatic events in Whitechapel. In Yorkshire, however, it gripped the public. Dozens of character witnesses described her as disciplined, devout, and unflappable. Others, fewer in number, hinted at a coldness beneath the porcelain. The prosecution argued that Ida selected her victims based on perceived personal slights, not crimes of passion, but petty bruises to pride. They presented her routine, her isolation, and the hidden sugar jar as deliberate tools of premeditated murder. The defense, lacking a confession, tried to claim accidental contamination, possibly from her herb garden. But in cross-examination, a constable presented a pressed flower found in a book in her kitchen, dried monkshood, labeled in her own hand. That sealed it. Sentencing. Ida was found guilty on all 4 counts of murder. However, in a rare moment of judicial mercy, the judge accepted an argument from the defense citing emotional derangement brought on by years of isolation and emotional abuse. She was spared the gallows. Instead, she was committed to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane, where she remained for the rest of her life. She died there in 1910, at the age of 62. According to the matron, her final words were, "Please no sugar in mine." Tea and shadows. Clemency House was closed within the month of her sentencing. It was eventually converted into a grocer's shop and later a bakery. Some say the bell above the door still jingled on quiet mornings, though no one had entered. Others say Malkin, the cat, was adopted by a traveling bookseller and lived to 20. But the town of Knaresborough never forgot Miss Greaves, not for her crimes, but for how ordinary they had seemed. For the quiet way she poured tea, folded napkins, and poisoned slowly 1 spoonful at a time. Because in the end, it wasn't madness or greed. It was the slow erosion of patience, the ache of unspoken scorn, and a teaspoon of something bitter hidden beneath the sweetness of civility. The Flannan Isles, off the western coast of Scotland, are a barren cluster of rocky outposts jutting from the Atlantic like broken teeth. Windswept, remote, and uninhabited save for sea birds and spray, they have long stirred sailors' imaginations, and none more so than Eilean Moor, the site of the infamous Flannan Lighthouse disappearance in 1900. That mystery of the keepers who vanished without a trace has inspired countless theories. But few know that, just over a decade later, the lighthouse on Eilean Moor would become the setting for another peculiar case. Not a disappearance. A theft. Of a kind no one expected, in a place few could reach, from men who had nowhere to run. This is the story of the lighthouse ledger theft of 1911, a case so quiet, so confined, that it nearly disappeared into sea foam. Eilean Moor, the end of the world. By 1911, the lighthouse had been fully restaffed and operated under the strict protocols of the Northern Lighthouse Board. Each station maintained a daily logbook for weather and lightkeeping operations, a supplies ledger listing every item used, received, or rationed, and a communications ledger noting any contact with ships or shore. The keeper team was a rotation of 3 men: principal keeper Alasdair MacLeod, assistant keeper Thomas Greaves, and second assistant keeper Hugh Lambert. Each man served 4-week shifts, during which they had no visitors except for the fortnightly resupply launch from the mainland. Life was Spartan, meals were simple, routine was enforced with near-military precision. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Which is why the missing ledger pages shocked everyone. The discovery. On May 17, 1911, a replacement keeper named Edward Callan arrived on Eilean Moor aboard the tender vessel Hebridean Swan. Upon his first inspection of the station logs, he noticed something peculiar. The supplies ledger, normally pristine and methodical, had 31 pages missing. All missing entries corresponded to March 1st through April 3rd, 1911. No tear marks, no accidental damage. The pages had been carefully cut out clean, even, and deliberate. At first, it was dismissed as an accident. Then the communications ledger was checked. 12 entries covering the same dates were also missing, and this time the cut marks were jagged as if done hastily. One torn scrap remained, the bottom of a page that simply read, "Final request denied, proceeding regardless." The men in question. By the time the missing entries were discovered, Alastair MacLeod, Thomas Greaves, and Hugh Lambert had already returned to the mainland. MacLeod was 58, with a long history of service in Northern Lights. A devout Presbyterian, widowed twice, and known for his uncompromising sense of duty. Greaves was younger, 35, a family man with 2 children in Inverness, and an amateur botanist who often pressed sea mosses between ledger pages. Lambert, the youngest, was just 22, a quiet man from Portree, said to be thoughtful, precise, and prone to solitude. None had disciplinary records, no signs of conflict, and yet 2 official ledgers had been vandalized under their watch. The quiet inquiry. The Northern Lighthouse Board, deeply protective of its reputation, did not involve police, not yet. Instead, they commissioned Captain James Roskelley, an internal investigator known for discretion, to travel to Inverness and speak with the men. He began with Lambert, the junior assistant. Lambert was polite, cooperative, but vague. He claimed, "I wrote my entries as always. I never touched the supply ledger." Roskelley noted his reluctance to elaborate, but found nothing overtly suspicious. Greaves was next. He admitted the logs had become less detailed in March due to MacLeod being unwell. "The principal had a bad spell of fever, slept much. I took over the weather notes." But again, no clear admission of tampering. Finally, Roskelley visited MacLeod. The principal keeper, though cordial, bristled at the inquiry. "The pages were removed. I cannot explain that, sir. Perhaps the paper was damp, warped by the sea, thrown out in error." Roskelley noted that MacLeod never once asked what was on the missing pages. A shadow in the logs. Though most records were gone, a few clues remained. In the back cover of the supply ledger, Roskelley found indentations, the faint impression of handwriting from a removed page. Using soft charcoal dust and tracing paper, the indentations were recovered. 3 phrases emerged. "Use the extra ration again." "They mustn't know we have it." "Not from the manifest." This changed everything. The team had apparently received, stored, and consumed supplies not recorded on official logs. In lighthouse terms, this was a violation of protocol bordering on criminal. All resupplies were inventoried with military precision. Anomalies could mean black market trades, smuggling, or unauthorized outside contact. The smuggler's path. Roskelley's final clue came from a fisherman in Ewing, who claimed that in late March, he'd seen a small skiff rowing near Eilean Moor at dusk, a strange occurrence, given the waters were treacherous and the lighthouse had not signaled any distress. He didn't report it then. "Wasn't my business," he said. "They weren't wrecked, just drifting." The implication. The lighthouse crew may have received unauthorized visitors, and the deleted logs were meant to erase the evidence. But for what purpose? Was it contraband alcohol, personal letters, or something more valuable, navigational data perhaps, or coded transmissions? No one could say. Why would 3 respectable keepers risk their careers over a few pages in a book? And what had they received that required such a careful erasure of official record? Following the troubling revelations from the faint indentations in the ledger's back cover, Captain James Roskelly now suspected that what had occurred on Eilean Moor in March 1911 was more than clerical carelessness. It was a deliberate act: collusion, concealment, and possibly criminal trade. But in a world defined by isolation, how could three men, confined to a wind-battered rock with no telegraph, orchestrate such a thing? That question was what made Roskelly return to the Flannan Isles alone, with nothing but a satchel of notes, a storm lantern, and a key issued reluctantly by the Northern Lighthouse Board. He was going to find out for himself. Return to Eilean Moor. On June 1, 1911, Roskelly stepped off the Hebridean Swan onto the wet stones of the island jetty. Alone among the seabirds and crashing tide, he climbed the 160 worn steps to the lighthouse. The keepers had already rotated out. A fresh team, including an inexperienced junior, manned the light now. Roskelly requested privacy and was granted a 48-hour stay to review operational conditions. He inspected the quarters: first neat bunks, iron stove, rows of canned goods in nailed-down crates, nothing out of place. But in a small drawer beneath the writing desk, he discovered a scrap of blue oilskin wedged tightly behind a rusted hinge. Wrapped inside, a folded sheet of ruled paper, barely legible but intact, a partial inventory list. It included 3 flasks of medicinal spirit, 1 sealed envelope marked Private SS Maldorg, starboard bearings log not to be entered. This list did not appear in the official April supply manifest, and the SS Maldorg had no scheduled contact with the Flannan Isles. The ship that shouldn't be. Back on the mainland, Roskelly began researching SS Maldorg, a small cargo steamer registered out of Glasgow. Her log, accessed through coastal customs in Ullapool, revealed something odd. On March 18, 1911, the Maldorg passed within visual range of Eilean Moor. There was no recorded stop or signal made. But her cargo manifest, signed 2 days later, had a gap in numbering between crates 112 and 115. No explanation given. Roskelly contacted the ship's captain, Robert Curran, who admitted grudgingly that a brief deviation had occurred. "We tossed a bundle in, they signaled for it, said it was medical urgent." When asked why he hadn't reported it, "Didn't want the board on us for going off-chart. We weren't even meant to be that far west." The package, it seemed, had been requested directly by the lighthouse keepers, but circumvented all official channels. And the log entry that might have documented the delivery, gone cut from the ledger. A motivated principal. Now Roskelly turned his attention back to principal keeper Alasdair MacLeod. He obtained medical records from Inverness, revealing that MacLeod had suffered from recurring neuralgia and had previously requested strong painkillers, which had been denied by the board in 1910, citing safety and policy. The medicinal spirit may well have been unregulated laudanum or raw alcohol, smuggled under the guise of emergency aid. But then why hide it? Why remove communication entries and supply logs wholesale? Because the issue was not simply medicine. There was something else in the package. The second ledger. While inspecting the remaining pages of the communications ledger, Roskelly noticed one entry barely visible, faded from sea exposure, dated March 19. It read, "Package received. Additional materials as agreed. Final note recorded in alt book per request." Alt book. There was no alternate communications log registered to Eilean Moor. Yet Lambert, the quiet second assistant, had mentioned writing down some notes for safekeeping during MacLeod's illness. After several letters and some persuasion, Lambert admitted that a secondary ledger, a personal one, had existed. He'd kept it during March and April. He believed MacLeod had taken it upon departure. But when contacted, MacLeod denied having it. A search of his quarters under warrant revealed nothing. Yet a fisherman from Ullapool would later testify that MacLeod, on April 6th, was seen burning a bundle of papers in an iron barrel, late at night, near his rented cottage. The theory forms. Piece by piece, the fragments of the case suggested the following scenario. MacLeod, suffering from worsening pain and frustrated by bureaucratic denials, arranged a private delivery via the SS Maldert, possibly facilitated by contacts from his past postings. The package contained not only medicinal spirits, but also navigational materials, possibly outdated charts, smuggled correspondence, or even encrypted notes unrelated to lighthouse duty. Greaves and Lambert, bound by loyalty, duty, or perhaps intimidation, agreed to keep the secret. They logged the delivery in an unofficial ledger, separate from the primary records. After consuming the spirits and securing the materials, MacLeod cut out the official entries, fearing exposure. The alternate ledger was destroyed upon return to the mainland. No funds were exchanged, no contraband was ever traced. Just pages gone. The board's quiet conclusion. Faced with limited physical evidence and the embarrassment of public scrutiny, the Northern Lighthouse Board issued no formal charges. Instead, they demoted MacLeod, assigning him to the inland navigation post at Loch Leven, allowed Greaves to resign, quietly and without pension, transferred Lambert to another station with a warning. All three men disappeared from lighthouse service within the year. The official report read only, due to procedural irregularities and lost documentation, the March 1911 service period at Eilean Moor is to be considered void of record. Operations continue. A mystery in margins. To this day, no one knows exactly what the men received that spring. Some believe MacLeod used his isolated post to intercept wartime information, a fringe theory with little evidence. Others suggest he simply wanted peace, and the smuggled goods were a desperate bid for relief. But the erasure of records, the silent collusion, and the refusal of all three men to admit wrongdoing left behind an unsettling echo. A reminder that even in a place with nowhere to hide, a man can still bury the truth beneath a missing page and a long storm. And so, on that lonely island, where light was meant to pierce through dark seas, something else remained hidden, quietly smuggled in, quietly written out, and never seen again. Finchley Road, North London, 1892. A stretch of street that flickered between respectability and modest commerce. Drapers, haberdasheries, pawnbrokers, boarding houses with flower pots in the windows. The smell of coal smoke, horse sweat, and paper always lingered in the air, especially near number 137, a modest red brick address with a brass plate that read simply, J. L. Cavendish Legal Correspondence. There was no actual solicitor by that name. No practicing lawyer, no public records, no law office filed with the city. And yet from that address, dozens of letters, contracts, and promissory notes flowed every week, signed, sealed, and stamped with convincing authority. It took 2 years before anyone realized that J. L. Cavendish didn't exist, and even longer to understand what had truly happened there. Because the story of the Finchley forgeries is not about stolen riches or dramatic court cases. It's about a man who forged not for money, but for identity, and whose quiet life became the perfect disguise. A man named Arthur. The man behind the alias was Arthur Tilsbury, a 47-year-old clerk who had worked for decades in the back offices of insurance firms, pension companies, and minor shipping agents. A man so ordinary, his handwriting was neater than his face was memorable. He lived in a rented flat above number 137. His neighbors described him as soft-spoken, punctual, and fond of pigeons. He wore the same gray wool coat in all seasons, and his only known indulgence was a weekly visit to a tobacconist on Goldhurst Terrace. No one knew that by candlelight, in the hours between midnight and dawn, Arthur was drafting legal documents, fake ones, with alarming precision. The first paper trail. The first clue appeared when Mr. Edwin Buxby, a merchant from Camden, attempted to enforce a contract for the sale of an inherited property in Yorkshire. The buyer, a Mr. Hensley, had signed the agreement at number 137, witnessed and notarized by J.L. Cavendish. But when the documents were presented in court, the judge noted something peculiar. The seal was too perfect a printed design, not embossed. The signature looped identically in every instance. The law office address listed no license with the solicitor's register. The document was declared inadmissible. The buyer vanished, and the name Cavendish came under scrutiny. The envelope that didn't match. The real unraveling began with a male clerk named Mrs. DeWitt, who handled routing for commercial letters in the Finchley district. She noticed that envelopes from number 137 always bore identical ink, slightly bluish and slightly smudged near the stamp. She marked one for inspection. Inside was a lease agreement between the Cavendish Agency and a Mr. Thomas Pelham, renting a storage cellar in exchange for £2 per month. A closer look revealed the signature again, J.L. Cavendish, identical to 5 others logged in the same week. She quietly passed it to her supervisor, who in turn contacted Inspector Harold Meacham of the Metropolitan Police's White-Collar Division. The quiet operation. Meacham began his investigation with subtlety. He posed as a client, inquiring at number 137 about lease documentation services. Arthur, posing as Mr. Cavendish's assistant, invited him in, offered tea, and explained that the solicitor was often away at chambers. The room was spotless, lined with books bound in matching green leather, most of them hollowed out to hold ink wells, rubber stamps, or folded contract templates. What caught Meacham's attention was a slip of paper tucked beneath a weight, a mock title deed dated, signed, and already sealed. But it was the signature at the bottom, seen now with his own eyes, that convinced him. He requested a follow-up appointment, left, and returned 2 days later with a warrant. What they found. Inside number 137, they uncovered 5 ledgers filled with names, addresses, and fake transactions. A collection of rubber legal seals, none registered to a real firm. Dozens of forged contracts, wills, lease agreements, and trade letters. A typewriter altered to simulate older script fonts. Over 200 envelopes, unmailed, already addressed. Most fascinating of all, Arthur kept character profiles, fictional biographies of each of his clients. Some were based on real people, others were entirely invented. Each client had a backstory, profession, signature style. Each forged document fit that world. A forger of people, not money. Despite the intricate deception, Arthur had made almost no profit from the work. He charged only small fees, barely more than the cost of materials. Several clients never paid at all. So what was the purpose? Under questioning, Arthur finally said, "I gave people what they needed. A lease, a letter, a sense of position. I gave them dignity when the system would not." He claimed that many of his clients were shopkeepers who couldn't get credit, or lodgers unable to secure tenancy without official documentation. He had, in his view, filled in the gaps left by bureaucracy. But was this a quiet act of social rebellion, or merely a man hiding behind invented paper to rewrite his own failures? Following the quiet but thorough raid of number 137 Finchley Road, Inspector Harold Meacham found himself at the center of a case that refused to behave like a normal fraud. No cash hoards, no fleeing suspects, no furious victims crying out for justice. In fact, what disturbed him most was the lack of anger from those who had unknowingly relied on false documents. Instead, what he encountered were individuals grateful for tenancy secured, jobs obtained, and identities protected by forged legitimacy. They weren't victims. They were beneficiaries, the clients of J.L. Cavendish. Meacham and his team began contacting names from Arthur Tilsbury's client ledgers, one by one. Out of 86 active profiles, they traced 41 to real individuals. Many of them had indeed used documentation prepared under the name J.L. Cavendish. Mrs. Lillian Reeves, a widowed seamstress, had used a forged reference letter to secure tenancy at a boarding house in Holloway. Mr. Patrick Denham, an Irish porter with a stammer, had provided a falsified apprenticeship letter to gain employment at a local smithy. Miss Y. Beaumont, an unmarried woman under assumed identity, used a forged deed of inheritance to reclaim a family heirloom from a pawnbroker without ever drawing suspicion. When interviewed, many of these individuals refused to testify. Some outright defended Arthur. Mrs. Reeves put it plainly. "He didn't steal, he gave. He gave me the only thing I couldn't buy, a chance to be treated like someone proper." A library of lies. Arthur's collection of forged documents was organized with astonishing care. Inspector Meacham described it as a legal library composed entirely of fictions. There were tenants' agreements with false landlords, used to imply stability, reference letters from fictional employers, last wills and testaments, occasionally drafted just to bolster credibility, letters of recommendation, signed by invented physicians, tradesmen, and military officers. Each forged person had a backstory, a personality, even quirks in their handwriting, all crafted by Arthur himself. Some forgeries even included minor spelling errors or ink smudges, intentionally added to make them appear more authentic. Arthur, in essence, was writing people into respectability. The man behind the ink. Arthur Tilsbury was no revolutionary. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't proud. Under questioning, he explained his motives without drama. There are systems for people with references, with inheritances, with the right last names, and then there are the rest of us. My father was a clerk. I became a clerk, but the world kept climbing while I stayed behind. When asked if he profited, he replied, "I never made more than what a cup of tea and postage cost me." But in his flat, investigators found something that suggested more than altruism. A framed, yellowed certificate with his name scrawled in ink: Arthur Tilsbury, apprentice solicitor, dated 1871, never validated. He had studied law, failed the qualifying examination twice, and was never admitted to the bar. A hidden grief. Digging further, Inspector Meacham uncovered a detail Arthur never mentioned. His younger brother, James, had been falsely imprisoned in 1880 for breach of contract, relying on a verbal agreement never honored. The case had gone to court. Arthur, then a legal trainee, had testified poorly, resulting in his brother's conviction and subsequent death in debtor's prison a year later from illness. From that point forward, Arthur left the law profession altogether. He did not speak of it again, not even during interrogation. The quiet trial. Arthur was formally charged with forgery of legal documents, use of false seals, and impersonation of legal authority, operation of an unlicensed law office. The prosecution presented the case as a breach of public trust, emphasizing that forged documentation, even when helpful, undermined legal integrity. But the courtroom atmosphere remained subdued. No client spoke against him. One even wrote to the court, "I had nothing and he gave me something to hold. For that I thank him." Despite the softness surrounding the trial, the law required sentencing. Arthur was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 2 years in Wormhood Scrubs, the minimum possible term for the volume of forgeries found. Final pages. While imprisoned, Arthur continued to write not letters, but fictional case studies of the people he'd helped. He reportedly told the prison chaplain, "Real people fade, but written ones live longer." Upon his release in 1894, he disappeared from public record. It's believed he took work as a cataloger for a bookbinder in Chiswick. No further forgeries were ever linked to him. When he died in 1912, the only possession in his will was a wooden box containing a fountain pen, a blotter, and a folder labeled Resolved Identities. The ink fades, but the idea remains. Arthur Tilsbury was not a revolutionary, not a thief, not even by his own claim a real criminal. He was a man who used the trappings of the law to create legal fictions for the poor, the forgotten, and the fragile. His forgeries rarely deceived the powerful. Instead, they filled the spaces where the system had forgotten to build bridges. And in those quiet pages, he wrote people into dignity. Because sometimes, the only difference between a forgery and a document of record is who holds the pen. Bath, 1846. A city of symmetry and elegance, where Georgian facades glowed in pale stone and well-dressed patrons drifted between apothecaries, tea rooms, and libraries. It was a place where appearances were currency, genteel behavior expected, and reputations managed with a delicate hand. Tucked away on Northumberland Place, between a confectioner and a tailor, stood the modest storefront of E. Tranter, bookbinder and stationer. The window display was sparse embossed journals, marbled end papers, a stack of weathered ledgers tied in twine. Few passers-by lingered. It wasn't fashionable. It wasn't modern. But inside that shop, amid glue pots, brass tools, and stacks of cracked calfskin, a quiet betrayal unfolded. Not of blood or theft in the traditional sense, but something subtler. The falsification of public record, and the slow destruction of trust between a city's elite and the man they paid to preserve their most important documents. The bookbinder Edward Tranter. Edward Tranter, 52, was Bath-born and well-respected among its quieter circles. A third-generation tradesman, he inherited the shop from his father and before that, his grandfather. He dressed plainly, kept clean fingernails, and wore spectacles attached to a ribbon. He bound volumes for doctors, lawyers, and even clergy. But his most prized service, one offered discreetly, was private ledger repair and rebinding. He was trusted with family wills, estate accounts, baptism records, and marriage registers, anything that required preservation without scrutiny. Discretion was part of the price. He had no staff, no apprentice, and that was precisely how his deception went unnoticed for so long. A curious complaint. It began with a letter. Mr. Alton Barrack, a solicitor representing the aging Lady Hargreaves, wrote to the city's legal archives in early 1846 to verify a detail in a family ledger specifically. A transfer of land noted in 1818 between the Hargreaves estate and a smaller farming family. But when the archive responded, the entry didn't exist. According to their copy of the ledger, no such land exchange had ever been made. Confused, Barrack produced Lady Hargreaves's personal copy, held in a finely tooled binding, repaired and rebound 2 years prior by Edward Tranter. The city archivist, Miss Agatha Sloane, compared the two documents side by side. The handwriting matched at least at first glance. The ink, however, was fresher in the disputed entry. The page number was misaligned, and the paper itself, though artificially aged, was different stock. Miss Sloane requested a full audit. The missing margins. Within weeks, 4 additional documents surfaced with similar discrepancies. A church marriage register containing an added line, linking 2 families not previously recorded as joined. A merchant account book where a debt was crossed out and replaced with a settled annotation. an inheritance ledger from 1803, with a new beneficiary inserted halfway through the list. And most damningly, a medical ledger in which the treatment records of a deceased child had been erased entirely, creating the impression of good health. All four had one thing in common: bound or rebound by Edward Tranter. A visit from the watch. City Magistrate Josiah Plymley, upon receiving the archivist's report, dispatched Constable Rook to interview Mr. Tranter under the guise of placing a binding order. The shop was quiet, scented of vellum and linseed oil. Tranter, dressed in a dark waistcoat, greeted Rook and accepted the false order with politeness. Rook then asked casually whether Tranter recalled binding a church record for St. Simon's Parish in 1844. Tranter blinked. "I've done many parish books. I cannot say for certain." Rook then asked whether he ever repaired documents without the original author's presence. "Often. Some are quite old, sir. Families bring them in, widows especially." The response was unremarkable, but what Rook noticed was a small collection of off-cut paper scraps, not yet burned, sitting in a tray behind the counter. One bore a name: Jonathan Cheek, a child deceased in 1838. That name had appeared on the medical ledger, with the line missing. A gentleman's theft. The formal search followed. On May 9, 1846, Edward Tranter's home and shop were entered with a warrant. The findings were methodical, hidden in plain sight. A false-bottomed drawer beneath his workbench containing spare marbled sheets, forged to resemble historic end papers. A set of aged quills, inked with dyes concocted from tea and soot to mimic aged pigment. A sample signature board, bearing dozens of imitated names. And most surprisingly, a private ledger, written in Tranter's own hand, with detailed logs of each forged or modified volume. Entries were coded but decipherable. H12 inserted land claim for client, beneficiary grateful. B4 child's record removed at request of midwife, silence assured. S9 forged marriage edition, unpaid. W2 misaligned heir, personal favor. Tranter had, for over a decade, been rewriting the private history of Bath. But why would a trusted bookbinder risk his reputation for what appeared to be favors, not profit? And who were the real beneficiaries of the ledgers he had so quietly edited? When Edward Tranter was brought in for questioning following the warrant search of his bookshop and home, he did not appear shaken. In fact, his first words upon entering the magistrate's chamber were, "It was never the binding, it was the fixing." He sat down without being asked. His hands, stained with glue and ink, rested calmly on the table. There was no lawyer, no denial, just a quiet man who had, for 20 years, bound the secrets of Bath between covers no one thought to question. The city expected scandal. What they got instead was a revelation of quiet desperation, favors exchanged, and the erasure of shame, not for gain, but for control. A gentle rewrite. Inspector Josiah Plymley and archivist Agatha Sloane together led the interviews. What they pieced together from Tranter's notes, records, and calm recollections was a network of clients, some highborn, some modest, all with one thing in common. They wished their past rewritten. And Edward obliged. Who asked for what? He began to name them. A midwife who had delivered a stillborn child out of wedlock. The family had asked Tranter to remove the line from the medical ledger so there would be no stain on future marriages. A wealthy brewer whose grandfather had signed away a portion of his land in 1818 while inebriated. Tranter was paid not in coin, but in free ale for life to lose the land transfer from a family copy. A widow who inserted her son's name onto a marriage record he had no legal claim to, ensuring his inheritance through a fabricated connection. A clergyman whose uncle had defaulted on a parish debt. Tranter smudged the record into illegibility, helping avoid excommunication. Tranter called it mending the moral fabric. He believed he was performing a necessary kindness, adjusting records for those whom society would otherwise punish disproportionately. The ethics of the eraser. Agatha Sloane, herself a historian by training, took particular interest in the forgery of baptism and death records. These were not mere property disputes, they changed the lives and legacies of entire families. One erased name meant a child never existed in parish eyes. One forged entry could change inheritance, legitimacy, or even bloodline. Sloane confronted Tranter with this, asking him, "How many lines of ancestry did you snip apart? How many children born into silence?" Tranter's answer was chilling in its certainty. "Not as many as society would have condemned anyway. I just trimmed the edges so their lives might fit in the frame." The Ledger of Secrets. The personal ledger found in Tranter's home contained coded symbols for each client. Delta for death record adjustments. For land deeds. For forged marital or baptismal entries. For any service involving estate disputes. Of the 126 coded entries, only 19 involved direct payment. The rest were described as favors often exchanged in trade or offered without compensation. But Tranter had kept everything: names, times, dates, the real documents and the forged counterparts. He called them ghost bindings, volumes that existed in two versions, one true and one accepted. The reaction from Bath's families. What surprised the magistrate's office was how quietly the city responded. No loud condemnations, no lines of angry victims. Instead, discreet letters arrived at the station, some imploring leniency, others defending Tranter's character, and more than a few thanking him for his discretion over the years. The clergyman, whose records were altered, publicly denied involvement. The brewer sent crates of ale to the constabulary with a note reading, "For services rendered on both sides." A retired midwife, too frail to stand trial, submitted a written statement. "Edward helped me erase a cruelty that never needed to exist. Let God judge him, not men with ledgers." Trial or mercy. The Crown weighed whether to pursue charges. Forgery of legal documents was punishable by transportation or imprisonment, but the complexity of the case, the lack of financial motive, and the reluctance of witnesses to testify made prosecution difficult. In the end, Edward Tranter was charged only with unauthorized alteration of civic records. He was fined £25 and banned from binding any public registers or parish documents henceforth. He remained free. A life folded quietly. Tranter shuttered his shop 3 months later. The sign came down, the windows were boarded up. But occasionally, a note would appear tucked in the crack between the door and frame. "I thank you for the record that was never made. My son still believes he was born in wedlock. That is enough. Your kindness gave us dignity. Bless your hands." Tranter spent his final years living with a cousin in Larkhall, making minor repairs to school books and hymnals. He never published a memoir, never defended himself in print. When he died in 1853, his effects included a notebook labeled "Mended Lives," a quill trimmed at the nib, a single sheet of vellum with the words, "Truth is what survives the ledger." Constable William Medhurst stood inside the crumbling lime kiln outside Chelsworth, holding one of the still-warm clay molds in his gloved hands. The soot had seeped into every pore of the stonework, but amidst the grime, the signs of methodical work were unmistakable. This was no act of desperation or idle mischief. It was a system built not for speed, but for quiet efficiency. The tinker known as Joseph, whoever he was, hadn't just been passing through villages and leaving behind crude forgeries. He was manufacturing coinage, albeit in the smallest denomination possible, and relying on the power of repetition, obscurity, and trust to move his fake pennies through Suffolk's rural economy. But the real puzzle still lay ahead. Why pennies? And how had such a tiny con caused such big waves? The weight of small things. In 1862, a single penny bought more than one might expect. A meat pie at a roadside cart, a pint of weak ale, a sheet of writing paper and postage, a loaf of barley bread. And in some circles, especially among farmhands and washerwomen, it was the small change that circulated fastest. Pennies weren't checked against ledgers. They were passed, pocketed, forgotten. Medhurst's notes began to reflect a theory. The con does not rest in value but in frequency. Where a shilling might be noticed, a penny may not. Where a banknote is examined, copper is assumed honest. It was volume over value, a scam that lived off the assumption that no one would care enough to look closely. But someone finally did. A face in the market. It was a butcher's wife in Lavenham, Mrs. Edith Clowes, who gave investigators their first usable description of Joseph. She remembered the boy more clearly: thin, pale like chalk, with a limp on his right leg. The man, she said, had cheekbones like a coffin nail and a thick country accent that sounded more Fenlands than Suffolk. He didn't haggle, paid exact change, smiled rarely, and always wore gloves. An arrest in Nayland. 2 weeks later, a message arrived from Nayland, a village to the south near the Essex border. A man matching Joseph's description had been spotted trying to trade a bundle of coins at a roadside stall, coins that, upon later inspection, rang hollow. Constable Medhurst and 2 colleagues traveled by cart the same day. They found him camped in the woods just east of the village, near a stream. He was tending to a small brazier with a covered cart nearby. Inside the cart were several ingots of lead, a stack of molds, some used, some new, a tin of bluing solution, a pocket-sized manual, Electroplating for Amateurs, 1858 edition, and a bundle of fabric-wrapped tools, including carving instruments used to etch the Queen's effigy onto a master mold. The man gave his name as Joseph Blay, aged 39, a traveling tinker and former apprentice metalsmith from Peterborough. He did not resist arrest, but when asked about the boy, he went silent. The boy's trail. No child was found at the camp, but nearby, constables recovered a child's satchel containing scraps of bread, a piece of chalk, and a well-worn penny with a perfectly cast face, the kind Medhurst now recognized as Joseph's work. 3 days later, the boy was found asleep in a hayloft in Stoke-by-Nayland, 5 miles away. He gave his name as Levi, no surname. He was 13, could barely read, and initially refused to speak at all. When shown the broken lead coin, he simply muttered, "Didn't know they break, thought they'd last longer." Levi hadn't made the coins, but he'd helped polish, plate, and most importantly pass them. He would carry 6 or 7 in a pouch, offering them as change or in payment for simple things: a pie tin, a box of matches. Enough to move product, never enough to raise alarm. Blay, it seemed, had found the perfect partner, a child whose presence disarmed suspicion and whose movements no one tracked. The tinker's truth. At his formal interrogation, Joseph Blay told a story that defied typical criminal motive. "You think I got rich off your blasted pennies? I cleared maybe 12 shillings a week, if that. Half went on the boy." "Why then?" Blay's answer was quiet. "Because the system pays men in pennies and laughs at 'em for being poor. Figured I'd give 'em a few more." He had worked as a foundry apprentice in Peterborough until a molten metal accident damaged his hand. Unable to work full-time, he turned to tinkering. He learned plating, mold casting, and electrochemistry from cheap books and county fair lectures. When his apprentice pay disappeared, he and Levi, his late sister's orphaned son, took to the road. At first, he tried mending and sharpening. But then he discovered a trick, casting near-perfect pennies in soft lead, plating them at night, and letting the boy pass them during the day. "We didn't steal," he said. "We duplicated. We made more of what the crown already had." The law's dilemma. Forgery of coinage was a capital crime. But these were pennies, and no one had suffered substantial financial harm. Most victims had passed the coins again before discovering their nature, and the deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became. Blay had never tried to counterfeit silver, never attempted to pass coins at banks or merchants with ledgers. His work stayed in alleys, stalls, and taverns, places where pennies meant food, not fortune. After deliberation, the court ruled. Joseph Blay would serve 3 years at Norwich jail, convicted of circulating false coinage. Levi was placed in the custody of a local Quaker charity, where he was eventually apprenticed as a metal worker. Final coin, final word. Joseph Blay was released in 1865. He disappeared from public record after that. Some say he returned to Peterborough. Others claim to have seen him repairing lanterns in Thetford. What remains is a small collection of forged pennies, now housed in the Bury St. Edmunds Guildhall, labeled "Lead Pennies of the Suffolk Scam, c. 1862. If you hold one today, it feels right in the hand, looks honest, carries a queen's face and a government seal. But when you drop it on the table, it doesn't ring, it thuds, quiet, dull. Just like the crime itself." Shropshire, 1891. In the historic market town of Much Wenlock, where cobbled streets curved around half-timbered buildings and smoke from hearths mingled with the scent of turned soil, few gave much thought to the man who mixed the powders behind the apothecary's counter. Mr. Edwin Pike, age 47, ran the modest dispensary on Wilmore Street. He inherited the shop from his uncle and kept it open 6 days a week, shutters up by 9, shutters down by dusk. His work was humble: tonics for upset stomachs, syrups for cough, powdered rhubarb, Epsom salts, tinctures for headaches and women's ailments. He was not known for cheerfulness, but he was efficient, and most importantly, he was trusted. That is, until the wrong powder made its way into the wrong bottle, and a healthy farmer's wife was found dead in her bed, blue around the lips, her spoon still resting in an untouched cup of tea. And Edwin Pike was nowhere to be found. The death of Louisa Rake. Louisa Rake was 39, wife of farmer Thomas Rake, and mother of 4. Described by neighbors as hardy as oak, she rarely visited doctors, preferring mustard poultices and her mother's old tinctures. But in early November, she complained of sharp stomach cramps and sent her eldest daughter to fetch a powder for digestion from Mr. Pike's shop. She received a brown glass bottle labeled "Pulv Gentian, dose, a half teaspoon in warm water." Louisa mixed the powder with tea, drank it, and within 30 minutes began convulsing. She died before the doctor arrived. Her husband insisted she had no chronic condition. The bottle was given to the police. It was sent to Shrewsbury for analysis. The results were immediate. The bottle contained powdered aconitine, a deadly poison, extracted from the monkshood plant. It bears mentioning, aconitine causes a sensation of burning, vomiting, slow paralysis, and eventual asphyxiation. It has no taste in small doses, and it was kept in nearly every apothecary's poison cabinet in carefully locked drawers. The label on the bottle, however, was printed, not handwritten. And Pike, when they went to question him, was gone. A vanished man. The shop was locked from the outside. The sign in the window read, "Closed for family illness, reopened Thursday." But Thursday came, then Friday, and still no sign of Edwin Pike. Neighbors hadn't seen him leave, though a young errand boy reported he had delivered a parcel the previous Monday, a small crate marked "Essences, Fragile," to the railway station at Buildwas Junction. Inside the apothecary, Accessed with the help of a blacksmith and the local constable, investigators found a swept floor, well-organized drawers of labeled herbs and powders, several receipts for recent purchases of aconitum root, ordered in bulk, and Pike's personal effects coat, pipe, spectacles all undisturbed. His savings, however, were missing. The reputation of a careful man. Until that week, no one had ever filed a complaint against Pike. He was known to lecture customers, particularly farmers, on dosage and overuse. He had even reported a rival chemist for unsafe handling of mercury pills the previous year. So the question emerged: was this murder-suicide or a deadly mistake? The printed label seemed to suggest a prepackaged product, something prepared ahead of time. But the dose, half a teaspoon, was far too large for aconitine, which is fatal in amounts smaller than a pinch. Who labeled it? Who filled the bottle? Who stood behind the counter? And why was Edwin Pike's signature not in the poison ledger for that day? The assistant no one noticed. As authorities questioned townsfolk and combed through Pike's order books, a name surfaced from several shop receipts. E. Holland appeared as the signatory for a number of recent tincture shipments. When questioned, several customers recalled a younger man behind the counter during the days Pike claimed illness early November. He was described as in his 20s, pale, wiry, and wearing round spectacles, dressed in an ill-fitting apron, spoke like a man from the cities. No one knew his full name. No one had seen him before November, and no one had seen him since. A receipt, a railway, and a wrong turn. Two clues emerged from Pike's desk drawer. A railway receipt dated November 5th, 2 days after Louisa Rake. Death for a crate shipped to Manchester, marked medical supplies. A crumpled envelope addressed to E. Holland, written in Pike's hand but never sent. The note inside read, "You've used my name and endangered my livelihood. If the Rake woman dies, you've taken it too far. This ends tomorrow. Return the key." Investigators now believed Holland had impersonated Pike, or at least worked under his name, and had possibly mistaken or willfully swapped dangerous compounds for benign ones. But Pike, it seemed, was preparing to confront him. And now both men were gone. Shropshire, 1891. In the historic market town of Much Wenlock, where cobbled streets curved around half-timbered buildings and smoke from hearths mingled with the scent of turned soil, few gave much thought to the man who mixed the powders behind the apothecary's counter. Mr. Edwin Pike, age 47, ran the modest dispensary on Wilmore Street. He inherited the shop from his uncle and kept it open 6 days a week, shutters up by 9, shutters down by dusk. His work was humble: tonics for upset stomachs, syrups for cough, powdered rhubarb, Epsom salts, tinctures for headaches and women's ailments. He was not known for cheerfulness, but he was efficient, and most importantly, he was trusted. That is, until the wrong powder made its way into the wrong bottle, and a healthy farmer's wife was found dead in her bed, blue around the lips, her spoon still resting in an untouched cup of tea. And Edwin Pike was nowhere to be found. The death of Louisa Rake. Louisa Rake was 39, wife of farmer Thomas Rake, and mother of 4. Described by neighbors as hardy as oak, she rarely visited doctors, preferring mustard poultices and her mother's old tinctures. But in early November, she complained of sharp stomach cramps and sent her eldest daughter to fetch a powder for digestion from Mr. Pike's shop. She received a brown glass bottle labeled Pulv Gentian, dose, a half teaspoon in warm water. Louisa mixed the powder with tea, drank it, and within 30 minutes began convulsing. She died before the doctor arrived. Her husband insisted she had no chronic condition. The bottle was given to the police. It was sent to Shrewsbury for analysis. The results were immediate. The bottle contained powdered aconitine, a deadly poison, extracted from the monkshood plant. It bears mentioning. Aconitine causes a sensation of burning, vomiting, slow paralysis, and eventual asphyxiation. It has no taste in small doses, and it was kept in nearly every apothecary's poison cabinet in carefully locked drawers. The label on the bottle, however, was printed, not handwritten. And Pike, when they went to question him, was gone. A vanished man. The shop was locked from the outside. The sign in the window read, "Closed for family illness, reopened Thursday." But Thursday came, then Friday, and still no sign of Edwin Pike. Neighbors hadn't seen him leave, though a young errand boy reported he had delivered a parcel the previous Monday, a small crate marked Essences, Fragile, to the railway station at Buildwas Junction. Inside the apothecary, accessed with the help of a blacksmith and the local constable, investigators found a swept floor, well-organized drawers of labeled herbs and powders, several receipts for recent purchases of aconitum root, ordered in bulk, and Pike's personal effects coat, pipe, spectacles all undisturbed. His savings, however, were missing. The reputation of a careful man. Until that week, no one had ever filed a complaint against Pike. He was known to lecture customers, particularly farmers, on dosage and overuse. He had even reported a rival chemist for unsafe handling of mercury pills the previous year. So the question emerged: was this murder-suicide or a deadly mistake? The printed label seemed to suggest a prepackaged product, something prepared ahead of time. But the dose, half a teaspoon, was far too large for aconitine, which is fatal in amounts smaller than a pinch. Who labeled it? Who filled the bottle? Who stood behind the counter? And why was Edwin Pike's signature not in the poison ledger for that day? The assistant no one noticed. As authorities questioned townsfolk and combed through Pike's order books, a name surfaced from several shop receipts. E. Holland appeared as the signatory for a number of recent tincture shipments. When questioned, several customers recalled a younger man behind the counter during the days Pike claimed illness early November. He was described as in his 20s, pale, wiry, and wearing round spectacles, dressed in an ill-fitting apron, spoke like a man from the cities. No one knew his full name. No one had seen him before November, and no one had seen him since. A receipt, a railway, and a wrong turn. Two clues emerged from Pike's desk drawer. A railway receipt dated November 5th, 2 days after Louisa Rake. Death for a crate shipped to Manchester, marked medical supplies. A crumpled envelope addressed to E. Holland, written in Pike's hand but never sent. The note inside read, "You've used my name and endangered my livelihood. If the Rake woman dies, you've taken it too far. This ends tomorrow. Return the key." Investigators now believed Holland had impersonated Pike, or at least worked under his name, and had possibly mistaken or willfully swapped dangerous compounds for benign ones. But Pike, it seemed, was preparing to confront him. And now both men were gone. Was this an accidental switch with deadly consequence? Or had Pike hired a man he couldn't control only to flee before facing the scandal? And who exactly was E. Holland, the assistant no one remembered hearing, and everyone forgot watching? The discovery of the unsent letter from Edwin Pike to a mysterious E. Holland only deepened the mystery. Forensic knowledge in 1891 was crude, but public pressure spurred by Louisa Rake's sudden and painful death meant that the Shropshire Constabulary had little choice but to dig further. Constable Francis Dorridge, a quiet man known more for his botanical hobby than his investigative skill, was assigned the case. It would prove to be the most complex and strangest investigation of his career. Poison protocols and the ledger gap. Among chemists and apothecaries of the time, there existed a strict rule: poisons must be recorded. Every sale, every use, every dosage. Pike had kept meticulous records over the years, his poison ledger handwritten in a neat slanting script, signed in ink after each entry. But between October 27th and November 6th, no entries had been made. Not for aconite, not for belladonna, not for arsenic, nothing. Yet during this same span, Pike's supply of aconitum powder had decreased by over a quarter pound. It was impossible that Pike would have failed to log his own uses. And so a theory emerged. Someone had access to his key to the locked poison drawer. A stranger in the records. Constable Dorridge took the letter and the suspicious receipt to the railway office in Buildwas. There, he examined the shipping logs from November 5th. The parcel sent to Manchester had been signed not by E. Pike, but by someone using the name Edwin Holland, a false combination of Pike's first name and the assistant's surname. Using this, Dorridge reached out to chemist shops in Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. 2 weeks later, he received a response from a small apothecary in Chorlton-cum-Hardy, on the edge of Manchester. Their newest assistant had presented a glowing letter of recommendation, supposedly signed by Edwin Pike of Shropshire, and had worked there for 10 days before suddenly vanishing. The name he gave: Edward Hollands. A trail of tinctures. The Chorlton apothecary provided a description. About 26. Medium height, sharp features, and a birthmark under the left ear. Spoke with a London accent. Knew more about botanical alkaloids than most students. Asked frequent questions about opium preparations and plant-based emetics. The day before his disappearance, Hollands had asked to take home some personal tinctures which were later discovered missing: digitalis, aconite, and strychnine. Another poisoner. Or simply a collector of knowledge, as many young chemists of the time were. But if so, why use Pike's name to secure employment? A hidden identity. As Dorridge expanded his search, he discovered the real man. Edward Hollands, formerly Edward Hollenshaw, had once studied chemistry at the University of London, but had been expelled for unauthorized laboratory experiments in 1889 after a student assistant was hospitalized following exposure to improperly mixed digitalis fumes. Hollands disappeared after the expulsion, until, it seemed, he re-emerged under a shortened name, peddling apothecary skills to quiet market towns that didn't ask too many questions. And somehow he'd ended up in Much Wenlock, behind Edwin Pike's counter. A letter with consequences. Back in Shropshire, Pike was still missing. But a clerk at a boarding house in Oswestry came forward with a curious story. A nervous man with soot on his coat and spectacles wrapped in paper had stayed for a single night in early November. He signed in as Mr. Elias Palmer, paid in advance, and left before sunrise. A search of the room found nothing except a second, unsent letter, burned halfway through in the hearth but legible on the edge. He is not what he said. He has used my name, may have killed that poor woman. I cannot prove it, but if I stay, I will be ruined alongside him. Pike had fled, not as a guilty man, but as a man convinced no one would believe he wasn't responsible. A decision in the dark. With Louis Arake buried, Edward Hollands vanished, and Pike presumed gone for good, the case might have faded into quiet rumor. But then in mid-January, a battered satchel was found in a dry ditch near Ironbridge Gorge. Inside were a charred apothecary receipt, a leather notebook labeled formulations, and a bottle labeled Elixir Pectoral. But most notably Edwin Pike's pocket watch, engraved with his initials. This changed everything. Was Pike attacked? Or had he taken a final step to disappear completely? And if Hollands was the true danger, why had he left Pike's watch behind as a message or as a taunt? When Edwin Pike's pocket watch was discovered in a dry ditch near Ironbridge Gorge, it did more than stir speculation, it reignited the case. The engraved timepiece, polished but not damaged, was a treasured family heirloom. It had been gifted to Pike by his uncle upon inheriting the Wilmore Street dispensary. He was known to wear it daily, checking it between customers like clockwork. For it to be found discarded, not buried, not hidden, suggested one of two things. Pike had been murdered, and the killer was taunting authorities. Pike had staged a disappearance, intentionally severing ties to the identity he once held. Either way, there was no mistaking the quiet message. Pike the apothecary was no more. Revisiting the apothecary. 3 months had passed since Louis Arake's death, and the old shop remained shuttered and silent. Constable Dorridge received permission to revisit the premises, this time with 2 chemists from Shrewsbury Infirmary. Their goal: a full forensic sweep of the drawers, bottles, and hidden compartments. Though crude by modern standards, their investigation yielded several key findings. The aconite jar, labeled with the skull and crossbones, had residue on the inside of its lid matching fingerprints different from Pike's, as confirmed by smudged ink samples from his notebook. A paper funnel with traces of copper sulfate and tincture of belladonna, suggesting Hollins had been experimenting with solubility and masking agents. Most importantly, a false bottom beneath the back shelf containing a folded list. Cheltenham, May 1889. Lewes, Sept. 1890. Wenlock, Oct. 1891. Derby. It was Pike's handwriting. A pattern of places. The first 2 towns, Cheltenham and Lewes, had both reported mysterious poisonings in their local newspapers in the corresponding years. In Cheltenham, a baker's apprentice died after ingesting tainted herbal lozenges. In Lewes, a widow succumbed to digitalis poisoning from what was thought to be digestive bitters purchased at market. Neither case had resulted in arrest. Both remained open investigations. Now, with much Wenlock added to the list, it appeared that someone, presumably Hollins, had been traveling town to town, assuming temporary roles in apothecaries or markets, and leaving confusion and corpses in his wake. But there was more. The final line, Derby, suggested a next stop, perhaps even a plan interrupted. A quiet tip from Derby. Dorridge's inquiries in Derby paid off quickly. A small chemist shop on Queen Street reported that a man calling himself Mr. Egerton had recently applied for an assistant position, producing a reference letter from Dr. Pike of Wilmore Street, Wenlock. Sound familiar? The letter was forged, of course. It bore the same tone and phrasing as the one used in Manchester. This time, the owner had been suspicious. Too many questions about poisons, too much eagerness to handle restricted materials. Egerton hadn't returned after his first day, but his address was recorded. The final room. At a narrow lodging house near the Derby Railway, Constable Dorridge and local authorities found a rented room under the name Edward Shaw. Inside, they discovered a travel bag containing 4 poison vials, corked and labeled, a scrapbook of newspaper clippings, most of them poison-related deaths from rural England, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the next man who chases me." Inside the envelope, "There is no justice in a world that lets fools mix medicines. I never meant to kill, I meant to educate. The difference lies in detail and most men ignore it. Pike tried to stop me. I offered him silence. He chose to run. And now you chase ghosts." Signed, E. Hollins. What happened to Pike? Despite efforts across 3 counties, Edwin Pike was never found. Some believe he fled to the north coast and boarded a ship to Canada. Others think he assumed a new identity and opened a quiet shop in some anonymous village. No trace of him, dead or alive, was ever confirmed. His name was cleared informally by the accumulation of evidence, but no formal pardon was ever issued. To the record, he remained a man who fled amid scandal. Hollins, meanwhile, disappeared once again. Derby was his last known location. Some claim to have seen him years later, in Glasgow, teaching chemistry under a false name. Others believe he died of his own mixtures, an experiment gone too far. The apothecary's lesson. The story of the apothecary switch in Shropshire faded from national memory, but lingered in professional circles. It became a case study in chemist ethics, read aloud in training colleges, and published in the British Medical Journal under the cautionary title, "Trust Labels and the Cost of a Mislaid Key." It reminded those who prepared medicines that precision was sacred, and that behind every label and bottle was a life held in delicate balance. A lesson taught bitterly with aconite.